Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're venturing into, well, a surprisingly complex world. Mental health treatment in 19th century England.
Yeah, it's definitely not as straightforward as people might think.
Forget that simple image of just asylums and doctors, because we're going to uncover the critical, often hidden roles played by families and the legal system.
Especially through something called Commissions of Lunacy.
Right.
And we've got some really fascinating source material for this. Excerpts from a book that digs deep into the psychiatric history of the time.
And the key thing, as you said, is moving beyond just the asylums.
Exactly. Our mission really is to shed light on those intricate relationships between families, individuals facing these difficulties, and the whole legal and medical landscape as it was evolving, how society understood it all.
Okay, let's unpack that, because for so long, the narrative about 19th century mental health in England, it's been dominated by the rise of asylums, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And those institutions, they undeniably brought huge changes. How people deemed insane were cared for, controlled.
And the psychiatric profession emerging alongside them, doctors taking charge.
Yes, the book confirms that broad picture, more asylums, more medical superintendents, rising numbers in care. But, and this is what we want to explore, that wasn't the whole story.
The family role.
Yes. While their direct involvement in, say, care and control might have shifted or maybe diminished over the century, it was still a really significant factor.
And becoming more public.
That's a key insight, yeah. This private family stuff was increasingly subject to public scrutiny.
Which is a different angle from, say, just looking at institutional care for the poor, which others have covered.
Right. We're deliberately focusing a bit differently today.
Now, this gets really interesting when you compare England to, say, continental Europe or America.
It does, yeah.
The emphasis seems a bit different there, less just on the asylum buildings themselves.
That's right. There seems to have been, relatively speaking, more focus on the relationships between doctors, patients, and their families.
And how that shaped the actual psychiatric ideas.
Exactly. What were the assumptions driving these different approaches?
Good question.
Well, you look at France, for instance. Robert Castell saw their asylum committal system as basically replacing the old lettre de cachet.
Ah, those pre-revolutionary warrants for imprisonment without trial.
Precisely. And building on that, Yannick Ripa argued that voluntary committal in France became, well, another tool for families.
A tool for what?
To resolve domestic arguments, maybe suppress rebellion from wives or children, things like that.
So not always purely medical concerns driving committal.
Not exclusively, it seems. Patricia Presswich's work on a Paris asylum supports this. Families saw asylums and the doctors as a convenient way, sometimes temporary, to handle domestic problems.
And Ruth Harris found psychiatrists could sometimes reinforce traditional roles for women.
Yes, even while sometimes advocating for them, it's complex. They could kind of sanction and impose these inferior roles.
Okay, and across the Atlantic, in America.
Well, Nancy Tomes talks about a collaboration between doctor and family, maybe a bit more positive framing.
But still integrated.
Oh, yes. The asylum and the family becoming part of this new psychiatric culture. And Elizabeth Lundbeck's work in Boston shows doctors becoming, essentially, experts in domestic problems in everyday psychological life.
So this family dynamic is crucial everywhere, maybe just less central in the usual English story.
That's the idea we're exploring. It underscores its importance.
Okay, let's pivot to these Commissions of Lunacy. Sounds very formal, very legal. What were they?
Absolutely formal. And a good dramatic starting point is that Earl of Portsmouth scandal in 1823.
The one with his second wife and her lover.
That's the one, a huge public sensation. But the actual legal procedure, the Commission of Lunacy Inquirino, that goes way, way back.
How far back?
At least the 14th century. It came from the Crown's role as parens patriae.
The parent of the nation.
Sort of, yeah. The ultimate guardian, with authority over the persons and, crucially, the estates of those considered not a sound mind.
So the crown steps in.
Well, indirectly. The power was delegated, first to the Lord Chancellor, then, in 1540, it shifted to the Court of Wards.
And their focus was mainly property.
Primarily, yes. Safeguarding the property of lunatics and idiots, as they termed it, from being exploited. It mostly served the wealthy. The focus was really on the assets.
Protecting the fortunes of the elite, basically. What happened next?
After the Civil War, the Court of Wards was abolished. 1660, the Court of Chancery took over responsibility for these estates.
And Chancery had issues.
Big issues, especially in the early 18th century, notoriously corrupt. Masters of Chancery were embezzling funds, including money meant for guardians of the insane.
Even the Lord Chancellor got involved.
He did, impeached for profiting illegally, selling positions. It was messy.
Wow. So a system really open to abuse, not just at the top.
No, evidence suggests it could be manipulated lower down, too, by individuals for their own gain. You see hints in Daniel Defoe's writings about illegal confinements in early private madhouses.
More misuse of the commissions.
Likely. But the 19th century saw reforms trying to fix this, making the process cheaper, quicker, expanding protection,
Leading up to.
culminating in the 1853 Act for the Regulation of Proceedings under Commissions of Lunacy. This brought in full-time masters in lunacy.
Making it more accessible.
Yes, that and later changes in 1862 and 82 opened it up more to people with, more modest means, not just the super rich.
So it evolved. Now, you mentioned that Earl of Portsmouth case again. How does that fit with these legal changes in the broader culture?
Right. The Portsmouth case, you have to see it in the context of this developing domestic ideology in England.
Like the Queen Caroline affair.
Exactly. That affair in 1820 was key. It really pushed forward this growing middle-class idea that domestic virtue is the condition of participation in public activity.
So it wasn't just about appearances. It was fundamental.
Yeah, the belief was that a well-run home, a virtuous private life, was essential for public trust, for having a role in public life.
Meaning your private life directly impacted your public standing.
Totally. A failure in your private family life could actually disqualify you.
And both the Queen Caroline and Portsmouth cases expose marriages without love, affection.
Yes, they drag private failings into the public eye. And the argument then became that a family failing in domestic virtue couldn't provide a proper psychiatric regime for a lunatic member.
That's a significant shift.
It really was. Suddenly, how lunatics were cared for within the family became a matter of public concern if that family didn't meet this standard of domestic virtue.
And the Portsmouth case was the first time the Times reported on one of these commissions.
Believed to be, yes. Turning a private family issue into a major public spectacle.
Which must have dragged a lot of private pain into the spotlight. And speaking of the public, the book talks about these commissions becoming almost entertainment. The lunatic on stage idea. What was so compelling?
It's a really fascinating and honestly quite unsettling aspect. The Times newspaper did cover these regularly for a while.
But then stopped.
Abruptly stopped regular coverage in 1845. Now, partly that's linked to an 1853 legal reform allowing closed courts in routine cases.
Less access for reporters.
Right. Once they weren't automatically public, the sensational coverage dwindled, though the regular coverage stopped before that act. But there were definitely concerns about privacy, about sensationalizing people's suffering and delusions.
Yet sometimes the court seemed okay with reporters being there.
Yeah, there's an instance where a Times reporter was criticized, but the commissioner in that same case publicly backed press reporting. So, real tension there.
Between privacy and public fascination. But what was actually drawing the crowds? What was the big attraction?
Often it seems the major attraction was simply watching the lunatics themselves during their examinations.
Actually seeing them interviewed.
Yes, and the courts would sometimes go to great lengths, like visiting the person at home if they couldn't be moved safely.
And the newspaper reports were quite vivid.
Oh, yeah. Dramatic, emotional descriptions. Talk of a melancholy picture of despondency. You had Dame Esther Filmer's incredibly detailed, disturbing delusions about her missing organs, which apparently evoked the greatest sympathy from the courtroom audience. It paints a really intense picture of the human experience behind the legal process.
It sounds almost like morbid theater.
In some respects, maybe. You had strange examples, like a rich guy sending invitations to his tenants to come watch his commission.
Really?
Yeah. Or William Eusden amusing the court by cross-examining witnesses himself. Then contrasts. Some people totally lost and silent, others detached, almost whimsical.
And some accepting their situation.
Right, like an admiral admitting his son should manage his affairs, or someone expressing happiness at a private asylum, or someone like Caroline Ann Tweedale, incoherently claiming titles but admitting she couldn't manage things.
So the audience was maybe looking for moments of clarity.
It seems like it. Anticipating unexpected rationality, maybe, or finding some kernel of truth in the midst of perceived incoherence. It really highlights how blurry that line between madness and sanity felt in the public mind.
Like people trying to decipher the mad mind in real time. Which raises the question, Did the individuals themselves have any way to share their perspective?
Well, yes. Starting around the mid-18th century, you begin to see writings emerge from people who'd actually been through psychiatric confinement.
Patient accounts.
Exactly, and it became a more established genre later on, by the late Victorian era. Psychiatry and its institutions, maybe inadvertently, created this discursive space.
The space for what?
For patients to articulate their delusions, yes, but also their suffering, their criticisms of the doctors, of the system.
And psychiatrists collected these.
Avidly, yes.
Ah.
Collected and even published them. It kind of mirrored a wider literary fascination with the morbid mind at the time.
So an unexpected dialogue starts happening.
In a way. But the book argues this discourse both, well, empowered and disempowered patients, gave them a voice, but within a framework that's still defined and confined them.
Like Foucault's ideas about power knowledge.
Kind of, yeah. The argument is that these commissions didn't just prohibit madness, they helped formulate the subjectivity of it. They shaped how it was understood and expressed.
And witnessing that formulated subjectivity was part of the public draw.
Very likely, yeah. A chance to see this process happening live.
Okay, let's dig deeper into the family's influence on actual psychiatric practice. How significant was their role in, say, diagnosis?
Hugely significant. Take the case of Miss Mary M. Her sister's account heavily influenced the diagnosis and treatment by Dr. Alexander Morrison.
How so?
The sister complained about Mary's treatment in an asylum, worried about the cost, criticized how her mother and servants supposedly indulged Mary. Financial worries, family dynamics, all tangled up with the medical view.
So diagnosis wasn't just based on objective medical observation.
Often not purely. That's a key point. The book makes this gap between psychiatric science becoming more public and the actual practice, especially for the wealthy, which was often kept very private.
Because of the stigma.
Exactly. So if you want to understand the practice, you have to look at that private sphere.
And the commissions, even though public, gave insights.
They did. They offered doctors experience, a platform even. But crucially, before the public hearing, there were usually these intense private consultations between doctors and families. That's where a lot of influence happened.
Were there cases where this family influence might have led to, well, questionable outcomes, misdiagnosis even?
The commission against Edward Davies in 1829 really illuminates this. It involved a top practitioner, George Mann Burroughs.
And what did it show?
It showed just how much doctors like him relied on what the families told them. The book suggests these wrongful confinement cases weren't just isolated scandals, but actually revealed something fundamental about the structure of psychiatric practice then.
How so?
Well, Burroughs emphasized physical symptoms in his writings, but in practice he seemed to lean heavily on family stories, family narratives.
A vulnerability lawyers could exploit.
Absolutely. They'd attack medical testimony by showing it was based on potentially biased secondhand information. Burroughs himself admitted diagnosis depended as much on representation, what was presented to him, as on his own examination.
So families held a lot of power in shaping the medical narrative and the legal outcome. How did doctors react to this reliance? Were there different views on diagnosis, on who should decide?
Oh, definitely different perspectives. John Connolly's inquiry concerning the indications of insanity is really important here.
What was his take?
It was partly a response to that whole crisis around psychiatry in 1829, defending his patron Brougham, who'd attacked Burroughs. Connolly really stressed the need for personal examination. He rejected using tricks to find hidden delusions.
More rigorous, patient-focused.
You could say that. He saw declaring someone insane as a distinct medico-legal issue separate from just treatment, a more cautious, legally aware approach.
And others disagreed.
Well, you had figures like Charles Dunn, more radical perhaps. He felt medical expertise should be the only guide for confinement and got frustrated with legal interference in court.
And then there's moral insanity.
Right, that diagnostic category pushed by J.C. Pritchard, describing behavioral problems without the classic signs of madness, like delusions.
And that could serve families' interests.
Potentially, yes. A way to control troublesome family members whose behavior disrupted things, maybe especially economically, even if they weren't mad in the old sense.
So behavior that was just inconvenient or went against expectations could get labeled.
That's the concern. A letter from John Addington Simons to Pritchard really shows this, using moral insanity for behavior causing domestic distress, often tied up with money worries.
So it wasn't just about emotional trouble, but economic stability too.
Yes. While emotional distress was part of Victorian psychiatry, these economic concerns were vital, especially in lunacy commissions.
And interestingly, Connolly, who started more patient-focused.
Yeah, later in his career, after he became successful running a private asylum for wealthy women, he seemed to shift more towards a family-centered model. Kind of like Burroughs before him, the practicalities maybe shaped the principles over time.
Okay, let's shift slightly. The book also talks about domestic management of lunatics. What did that actually look like day to day?
Well, remember, this was a time of widespread popular interest in things like phrenology, physiognomy, trying to read the mind from outward signs.
So people felt they could interpret madness.
Yes, and the family home was a key place for this. Domestic norms, family life became the measure.
Any examples?
There are letters from a man named Middleton about his mother. It's like domestic psychiatry in action. He had his own theories about why she was ill-blamed, her personality, her secrecy, and he actually resisted medical help.
So families were acting like amateur psychologists, developing their own cures.
Sometimes, yeah. Trying to use affection, relationships as therapy. We see examples of families trying this, and sometimes they'd incorporate someone into the household specifically to manage another family member's state. Roles blurred between family, manager, and doctor.
Like hiring keepers.
That was common too, yes. Hiring keepers from private madhouses to manage someone at home, offering discretion. And this idea of unbosoming, sharing anxieties openly was seen as therapeutic, tied into evangelical ideas about the family.
Sounds incredibly intense and, well, potentially fragile. What could upset these domestic arrangements?
Oh, lots of things. Internal family arguments were huge. The Rosa Bagster case, where her mother and grandfather fought over her care, shows how family conflict could wreck any attempt at home management.
And money again?
Always a factor. Families trying to control the finances of members they saw as incapable, plus immense shame and fear of public attention.
Leading to concealment.
Definitely. Families going to great lengths, moving house, bricking up windows, never letting someone out alone, trying to keep it hidden.
But containment could fail.
And when it did, it could lead to public chaos, outbursts, neighborhood harassment. It really challenges that Victorian myth of the family as just a private haven.
So it wasn't just intolerance driving people to asylums.
The book argues it's more complex than that. Other factors were involved.
Like what?
Like deviations from social norms even without obvious delusions. The case of George Davenport destroyed property based on religious ideas deemed unsound, especially if marital expectations weren't met.
So commissions could challenge husbands, too.
Yes, challenge patriarchal authority in cases of mistreatment within marriage. Sometimes divorce was the real motive behind trying to prove insanity. Mr. Ruck's case, his wife alleging insanity due to violence, the law considered breaches of the domestic code.
The boundaries of unsound minds seem very fluid, tied to social rules. Which brings us finally to public authorities. How did they handle home care ambiguities?
Right. We've seen the limits of domestic care, the strain on families. Sometimes families actually wanted the state to step in to control wayward members.
A convergence of interests.
Between propertied families and the state, yes, which connects back to Castell's idea of psychiatry replacing lettre de cachet, helping family control. Though some saw psychiatry as a benign aid to families.
But the power dynamics were still murky.
Very ambiguous, especially regarding families' power over insane members at home. Cases like Spencer and Pelham, with the nurse accused of abuse, showed how hard neglect was to prove privately.
But sometimes authorities did intervene.
Yes, the George Smith case is key. Magistrates stepped in over neglect concerns, leading to legal action, public scrutiny. It shows that tension between public authorities and family privacy.
And the lunacy commissioners relied more on
Shaming.
more on creating moral pressure through public opinion and the press than on brute enforcement power, it seems.
So summing up that period.
By the mid-19th century, a deepening sense of ambiguity around home care. No clear laws banning it, but growing public suspicion, moral pressure. Even as top officials were reluctant to force people out of family care. Okay, let's wrap this up. It really sounds like 19th century England had a far more complex, family-involved approach to mental health than maybe the simple asylum story suggests.
Absolutely. It was this incredibly intricate dance between family, the law, and these emerging psychiatric ideas. Asylums grew, yes, but families stayed central, their actions increasingly watched by society and the legal system.
And the Commissions of Lunacy really open a window onto that.
They do. They reveal all those tensions, individual liberty versus family authority, public concern, all filtered through domestic ideals and, often, money.
This has been such an illuminating deep dive. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Given that history, the reliance on family, the sheer difficulty in defining and managing mental health privately back then.
Mm.
How do those dynamics echo today? In our debates about community care, patient autonomy, the family's role now,
That's the provocative question, isn't it?
what's really changed and what ghosts of the past might still be shaping how we approach these issues? Definitely something to ponder.
For sure.
Thanks so much for joining me for this incredibly insightful discussion.
My pleasure.